Welcome. Welcome to the dialogue with one of my favorite scientists in China, Professor Zhao Yi. He has many hats. Start with the neurobiologist, president of the Capital Medical University. And I would think he's probably, David will correct me if I'm wrong, he's probably the second scientist from China that has ever been invited to speak at Davos, but the first one to own a stage for himself. And so let's start with Davos. How do you like Davos so far?
It's interesting, and clearly there's more interest in economics and other aspects of global issues than science, and I hope there'll be more interest in science technology, which I believe determines to a large extent what the future holds for us.
Right. So Davos should focus more on the future-oriented topics, and that's why we're here. And reading his bio, I'm sure you all have done, you'll find a clear cutting line that he went to United States to pursue graduate study in 1985, went to University of California, Harvard, taught at Washington University, Northwestern, 20 years in total. That was great. And then he returned to China in 2007. And then boom, in 12 years, he achieved, that was very action-packed 12 years. I'm going to read this from my notes. He funded or involved in funding 5 research institutes, a new university, a widely influential science conference in China, an award on science, and this is my favorite part. He also set up a media with huge social influence, 2 million followers to start with on Weibo. So my immediate question is that just you or just Tim Zhao Yi with your same name doing that all the time? But why did you come back to China in the first place? And are you doing exactly what you planned to do when you came back 12 years ago?
So that's a few questions combined.
Yes.
And it appears to the rest of the world that I'm doing lots of things. But in essence, I'm primarily a scientist. I'm secondarily a teacher. Most of my time I spend on science. But my science is experimental science. It's biomedical science. You do experiments, and you design experiments. You discuss results and interpret what should be done. So by my age, I don't do experiments. The students do experiments. So it's easy to talk about it, but the doing part takes longer time. So that's why I have plenty of time. When I don't have to do experiments, I need to do something else. So I read lots of literature in terms of papers. And I might be reading more papers than any Chinese you've met. And, but on the other hand, reading on computer or on cell phone, you can only do so much, then you do something else. So for everything else I do, from writing blogs or chairing meetings, and those are lots like other people who jog. I don't like sports, so I don't jog at all. I've never run continuously more than 10,000 meters in my entire life. And I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't get any pleasure out of smoking or drinking. So I have saved lots of time from what everyone else does, and I spend most of the time with words. And in a way it's good and in a way it's bad. My mother's family, continuously 6 generations, are bookworms. So I get that part. My father is not like that. My father likes to exercise every day, dragging my mother to do that. My father is now 90 years old. My mother is 88. My mother really doesn't like that, and I don't like that either. So I save time from doing everyday things everyone else do and spend on activities related to words. I came back to China more than 12 years ago, mainly because I find that it's important for us to see whether we feel there's belonging, and if you do, where do you belong? And it came down to I belong to China, so I went back. So it's a sense of belonging. And that's the main reason, but the trigger is very simple. When my generation of Chinese went to the US in the 1980s, the difference between US and China is so large in every aspect. And in science in particular, most of the routine experiments that's going on in US or in Europe could never be done in China. And then all other aspects are also very different. So it was natural to go to the US when you have the opportunity. And we learned a lot from good teachers, and we have very impressive teachers. One of my teachers in the US, he, on the side, he goes to Mount Everest. He climbed Mount Everest. He also went to the second highest mountain, K2, without oxygen. So I think he's done a lot more than I have done. I could never have done that. So you see lots of different things in the US. So it was natural to decide to stay. But one trigger for me to think about going back to China was the actions of the US government after 9/11. You know, we all feel history makes heroes. And Lincoln, Roosevelt, and so they are heroes, but some people feel, well, it's because at those historic junctions, you rise up to the occasion. Now we do get to see the opposite. Bush Jr., when there was an occasion for him to be a hero, he went below. And that was a huge disappointment. And not only that, Vice President Dick Cheney, his legal counsel, David Addington, Paul Wolfowitz, and John Yoo, those are basically thugs in the government that was ruining the good parts of the US. And you see they would maintain Guantanamo Bay, which is an area of Cuba under US control, but the US government deciding it's so powerful, Guantanamo Bay has no laws. And this has never happened in history in a legal society. I mean, legal society admits whoever controlled the land, the laws would have to apply. You know, when you look at that, there's a huge disappointment in my mind. So I started to think about, well, if I don't like it here, now I go back to China.
How would you compare now, 12 years later, the science development in China and in US, as well as how about the scientific community, researchers like you?
That part I did not actually expect. And that is, when I went back to China in 2007, science in China is starting to get more and more support. But no one could expect whether it's going to go this way, or that way. So in terms of funding after 2007, science funding in China has been going exponential. And I was right in the beginning of that exponential phase. So investment in science has been incredible in China, and that helps. And the second factor, which none of us expected, is the election of Trump and how Trump treats China. So because of Trump is trying to squeeze China, China have come to this consensus that there will be even more support of science. So in Chinese, we have saying of 好心办坏事, that you have good intentions, but you've done something bad. Donald Trump is exactly the opposite for Chinese science. His intentions are bad and evil, but the effect for Chinese science is all great. And that factor I've never expected, so that was completely accidental.
So even science in China has the Trump bump.
It's
That
a
media is
huge
enjoying.
bump. A few years ago, before Trump's election, Jack Ma, a wealthy Chinese businessman who's on the board of Davos, and I were screaming at each other. We don't know each other, but we were screaming at each other in the media. He was saying higher education at Peking University or Tsinghua University, our universities, are useless because he went to a very crappy university and he became a billionaire. He thinks higher education is useless for China. No, I said, that's wrong. And it might be useless for you, but it's useful for a country. In a country without us, then whatever you learn, your talent cannot be used well. So we scream at each other. He also said science technology are useless. He said in China, you should just copy and import technologies from other countries, and then you do a little tweaking to make it applicable in China. So I could never win an argument over him because he has so many followers. Like Trump, his followers are mostly stupid people, or in Hillary Clinton's terms, deplorable people. Maybe Jack Ma's are not deplorable people. They're just stupid people paying money for stupid products. But on the other hand, they always have a larger following than anyone who have a higher education by nature. So there was no way I was going to win an argument with Jack Ma. Now Trump came along, Jack Ma completely changed. He's now telling everyone science is important. And if you listen to his talks now about science, he can go along, have a very long talk about science technology. There's lots of factual errors in his talks, but he's forcing him to say science is important to China. So while I'm very angry at Trump for everything he's done damaging humankind, I mean, he's really helping scientists in China. So I should really tell you the secret that I'm very grateful for whoever deplorables electing Trump, so that my funding in Chinese science has been steadily increasing further. Thank you, Trump.
I'm sure
and the deplorables who elects you.
I'm sure he
So
will
keep
receive
electing
a thank you
him.
note.
I'll be happy.
So the consensus is there, and as you said, thanks to the Trump bump, the funding is there as well. But funding alone is not enough, and you are a big criticist. You criticize a lot about the integrity of the science community, especially sometimes the misuse of the fund or the corruption, this and that. I'll cite some problems of the integrity in the science community, including, for instance, the numbers. China has 4 million researchers. Now it's the world's largest producer of scientific articles. Meanwhile, according to an article published at the website of 知识分子, funded by you, that although China contributes 8% of the world's scientific research papers between 1978 and 2017, it also has 28% of the world's distracted articles due to plagiarism, fake peer review, you name it. It's 8% versus 28%. So
there are lots of problems in science in China.
Yeah.
So before I returned to China in 2007, I started working with scientists in China in 1995. And the effort was to reform some existing institutions and establish new ones so that a new system of merit-based science or merit-based research support would be increasingly important in China. And that I've put lots of effort into. And so I've been involved in either reforming or establishing new institutes in China, perhaps more than anyone alive or dead combined. So I've been Institute of Neuroscience in Shanghai, National Institute of Biological Sciences in Beijing, the entire School of Life Science, Peking University, Center of Life Science at Peking University, which I co-run with the Tsinghua colleague, Yi Gongxi, and then the PKU IDG McGovern Institute for Brain Research, and now the new Chinese Institute for Brain Research. And I'm also tangentially involved in an operation in Shenzhen. So, and my efforts has always been to make sure when there's new funding in science, it should be properly used and merit-based to support young scientists, all good scientists, regardless of age and gender, so that they can contribute to advancing science for the benefit of humankind. And I do lots of that. And not only I do that, and I often get angry to see even more funding in science in China were put in the wrong hands and handled on the wrong way. And there's lots of waste in science funding in China. And then when you have that, it is also corrosive. There can be young people realizing, I don't need to do good science. I should follow whom and whom. And I brown-nose those people, then I get well-funded. So it distorts science. And those are things I don't like, and I've written frequently about those. And the effect is, the immediate effect is minimal. No one is going to listen to you immediately. They control whatever they control. But I think over the long term, I hope, or I wish, that some youngsters growing up, reading what I wrote, would then want to do the right thing. And now I've been writing more than 20 years by now, and I do see some youngsters are doing the right thing, but you still do a significant fraction that's not. So that's how to run science. And then at different levels, there'll be ethics, whether you are doing science for human benefits or for personal glory or financial benefits, or there'll be frauds in China, and else it has happened elsewhere, and the issue is how we handle it. And so those who read Chinese know that a few months ago I created one of the biggest uproar about frauds in China because I drafted a letter. I did not really send it, but I sent the draft for other people to help me revising, and the draft was leaked, and because I pointed fingers at major figures, that many people are unhappy. On the other hand, there are other people who are very happy, saying this should be pointed out. We have to be holding on to the highest standards in science. So these are the other things. Basically, I'm doing these things, and I look at, say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. So I got a reputation in some parts of China saying I love to lecture to people. No, that's actually not true. I love to say what's right and what's wrong.
I think we have another word for that, is the child that says the emperor doesn't have clothes. And you mentioned about the ethic issues. I think the incident that really brought the ethic issue front and center of the world stage is the gene-edited baby. And how was that a wake-up call for the science community in China? How did you react, and how did the science community in China react to that?
Well, I think it's a very important issue, and there's international disagreements about whether one can or cannot manipulate germline cells, the cells that would give rise to next generation. I am of the view that germline gene editing should not be done. But there's other people, including some in the US, some at Harvard, believing that can be done as long as it's under certain guidelines or controls. My view is very simple. A germline editing would spread to the entire world with the potential. And the other thing is you can never come up with a real guideline on which gene can be modified, which cannot. And so it will be out of control if you allow that to happen. Now, the issue with the case in Shenzhen is because Shenzhen is a new city. 40 years ago, it's a very small village. So its science and technology and medicine are poorly developed. And it doesn't understand much of the common sense. So that's why it happened in that city, because basically there's very few people who's knowledgeable around. It did not happen in Beijing or Shanghai. And that is because the technology are much earlier and better used in Beijing and Shanghai, but no one is doing germline editing, don't edit babies, because in Beijing and Shanghai, there are enough people who knows that this should not be done without permission. So it has not happened. So this is saying science technology sometimes spreads too fast to areas other traditions has not come up. And China will be a continuous area to watch in China, because in my field, molecular biology, I do molecular biology in the brain, but molecular biology techniques are in general, very easy to learn. Most technology, once invented, can be learned within a few days. So the technology would be spreading fast. Would other guidelines and ethics be coming up hand in hand? And that requires some time and effort.
Do you think we should set boundaries on that? And do you think the international community or the Chinese scientist communities will try to set the boundary?
I think for technologies like this, there has to be an international consensus, not only international consensus, but international guidelines. At this point, it has not been so easy, because some in the West are trying to use the Chinese young scientists to push the borderline so their company in the West can do it. Right? There is very little need for germline editing. Now, each of us have 2 copies of each gene because we have 2 chromosomes. So if your father have 1 copy that's mutant, it's 2 from your father, 2 from your mother. The combination is a very low percentage would inherit the disease. If your father has 1 wrong copy, 1 right copy, your mother has 1 right copy, 1 wrong copy, the frequency of getting a diseased child is still 1/4, which you can do by gene diagnosis to eliminate that 1/4 and choose from the 3/4 of healthy ones. It's only when both of your parents, 2 copies of the gene in your father and 2 copies of the gene in your mother are all mutated, then you need to do gene editing. There's no other way around. But this frequency would be extremely low. And so should you allow gene editing to treat a very low frequency disease, or you can come up with some other compromise. For example, you can ask people, if they have 2 copies of the same gene wrong, they should inform their spouse beforehand. So there should be an extensive discussion to come up with the right guidelines. And for those who's pushing for permitting germline editing, and I believe, including some at Harvard, I believe the ulterior motive is to be able to edit in any gene customer requested. You can have a gene mutated, then your muscle will be much larger. There was a German kid at 5 years of age, because of gene mutation, his muscle strength is like a 15-year-old. So my family, we don't have lots of muscle. They should be custom-made, lots of muscle babies from my family. Then there are other people who wants to increase 1.0 GPA for their kids. At some point that could be possible. And then it would end up lots of people want to edit in lots of genes. Then it would be out of control.
So when the international community set the guideline, watch the potential erosion from the commercial side. And I also want to bring politics into the discussion as well, especially the geopolitics. How worried you are about the US-China trade/tech war and how that's impacting the life of many researchers from the Chinese origin?
I think this is very unfortunate. Basically, China is developing, and China have increasingly adopted policies, regulations that's good for everyone. Now, at which point should China be taking a policy that has been practiced in other countries? It's a very tricky issue. Let's say any Western government official would like Chinese government to have Western policy even 40 years ago. But if China took all those policies 40 years ago, China would have collapsed a long time ago. So when China should take what policy, it's a very tricky issue. Let time help the entire process. And so I completely agree there should be mutual dialogue to see what's the best for the world. What I'm fundamentally against, like any liberal in the entire world, what Trump is doing is really very primitive. It's selfishness. That's what Trump cares about, and in the end, that's going to be detrimental to every country involved.
And it's not just Trump. We are seeing a world with rising populism, with rising isolationism and all of this. Scientists are by nature believers of cross-border collaboration because you care about the shared future of the humanity. So as scientists, do you think the scientific community, the international scientific community, can make some changes to the trends?
In the past, history tells us science and scientists are the unifying forces through all the World War and other troubles. Now, that is partly because a country strong in science are on the right side of history. What we are facing now is a very tricky issue. the country that's strongest in science are now on the wrong side of history, is leading an anti-intellectual movement. It's suppressing climate science in its own country, that is the US, and it's disrupting the world consensus about climate change. And so for this to happen, it's completely new. And that is in history, when there's problems of Russian or Soviet scientists being persecuted for non-academic reasons by Soviet or Russian government or by Nazi government. There's lots of support outside from British and American scientists. Now, when American scientists, for example, American climate scientists, are clearly being suppressed in the US, who's supporting them? The US scientists, most of them, non-climate scientists, are not speaking up for the climate scientists. Other countries are not doing that either. And when the Trump government wants to prosecute American scientists of Chinese origin, no one is standing up, except I do that occasionally. That American scientists are afraid because they are afraid of NIH cutting funding of the institution. And European scientists are completely confused what's really happening. I mean, it's basically a very new situation now that we don't know how long is that going to take for this phase to get over. And, but we should all wait for history to judge at difficult times like this, how many people have been on morally low grounds and for how long.
Let me change the tone a little bit and do to be more future-oriented. I know you're very passionate about education and the next generation of scientists, from the students to the researchers. What do you think is improving in Chinese science education? What's still lacking?
I love teaching, and my family has been teaching for 140 years, 141 years continuously. And I've been teaching since I was a faculty on WashU at Washington University in St. Louis, and I've been teaching courses. Not only I teach, I write my own teaching materials, and I teach Mendel, Morgan, and really getting students to read original literature and see how they develop their ideas, how they do their experiments, how they get their conclusions. And I believe education is what advances humankind. And Trump is the counterexample of people who don't get enough education, then leading the country to a blind alley. And in China, the education has traditionally been based on trying to learn, not to analyze or criticize or to go further, create. So that is an issue. But I think that's an issue that has both sides. That is, emphasizing learning gets you very fast into catching up. And the next phase will be, then you should be more creative. And I have full confidence that many Chinese, as time goes on, will be more creative. And if I look at scientists in China, and more Chinese scientists are more creative. In the past, they can barely publish an English paper. Now, Chinese scientists publish in Nature Science all the time. So that's a change. I'm not saying that change is sufficient. I think we're in a different phase in Chinese science. Many scientists are publishing in international journals, but then the quality are not necessarily good. And I also see problems of some major flash journal papers have deficits, which I am not satisfied. But I do see that this will be going better and better as time goes.
My last question, and then I'll take one question from the floor, is the biggest news now is about the Wuhan virus and the outbreak in China. So from the view of a scientist, is there anything we can do to prepare us for such outbreaks and what we need to do in moments like this?
In moments like this, scientists like me, who are not experts on virology, should not pretend to be experts. There are very few real experts because it's a new virus. A new virus, you cannot forecast or predict how it's going to behave. Otherwise, it's an old virus. So we have to admit there's lots we don't know. We have to be very cautious and balancing how to prevent the spread of the virus, how to cure patients versus social stability. So that's a very tricky issue. I don't think anyone should be lighthearted in pretending to know.
Thank you. Any question from our audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm from the Wellcome Trust. We're a medical research foundation. So I have two questions. One is a point that you made about kind of this idea that there's a long tail of quite poor Chinese science, but the very best science is maybe better than. Is this on? I'm not sure. Yeah, but is maybe better than a lot of people internationally are willing to recognise. Do you see that, and if so, what do you think people outside of China need to do to better understand the quality of the very best Chinese science? If we're kind of looking in, and the second question that's somewhat related to that is, do you also have any reaction to Westlake University, which is, as I understand it, the first private university that's been opened in China doing research, and do you see that as a trend or as a helpful addition to the likes of Tsinghua and Peking University?
Well, I can answer the second question first, because I was involved among the 7 people who proposed the establishment of Westlake University. Li Gongxi from Tsinghua is the one who leads the university. I think it's a very good effort, and it has gone through lots of difficulties. I think it's now going to go, most likely, very quickly go into the exponential growth phase for Westlake University. And so I have full confidence it will become a very good university. And whether there will be more, that's more difficult to predict. And that issue will be much broader than a single university. So I don't think anyone can really predict at the moment. Because I was involved, especially early 2 or 3 years, there's lots of difficulties I saw that it's very hard to imagine. And I think Yigong is going to write about it in 20 years of not just asking for support, but then tell you what was the crisis he went through. For science, and I welcome question from Wellcome Trust. Wellcome was an American who set up a drug selling house, who then went to Britain, and then it became a British pharmaceutical company. And in his early time, more than 100 years ago, he invited scientists to run Wellcome physiological laboratories, Wellcome pharmacological laboratory. One of the early hires he had for physiological laboratories was Henry Dale. Henry Dale discovered histamine and also proved that adrenaline is important for neurotransmission. So he had made tremendous contribution to science. He got a Nobel Prize, I think, in the 1930s. And I have several academic pedigrees. One of those went to Henry Dale. So I'm actually claiming blood relationship with Wellcome Trust. Now that Wellcome Trust have given up the profit part, becomes completely non-profit. It's the largest philanthropy in biomedical science, or maybe the largest philanthropy in science. So I actually hope that there will someday Chinese philanthropists who will learn from Wellcome and set up one even bigger than Wellcome Trust. And I also hope if that ever happens, that should support not only Chinese science, it should support science internationally, including Britain, whose funding is not as well as it used to be. So I think Chinese science, I'm not sure it's that underappreciated. I think any new institution, new kid on the block including new labs, when they first come along, the bar would always be slightly higher. And then once people get to know your reputation, it gets easier. And I can give you an example. When I was in famous labs as students, it's easy to publish papers. So I published in Nature in 1990. But when I had my own lab by 1995-4, when I sent out my first paper, it should have been a Cell paper. That ended up in development mainly because the editors and reviewers haven't seen this new kid. But then after that, it gets easier. And it doesn't change. So if I switch a field from my well-known field to another, then I become a new kid again. The reviewers, editors are again going to put a higher standard. So that's a natural process actually for everyone. So I don't think that's targeting China at all. And it just changes, and new kids has to prove your reputation, and then you get to be having an easier time. So I don't think that's a big problem. I actually have a bigger worry about that part, because some of the new Chinese scientists knows how paper would get into Nature, Science, and Cell. So sometimes they put in results that's not so rigorous, which I have kept telling them not to do that. Most of them don't listen to me, but I hope over the time we can improve that problem.
Thank you, thank you. What a fascinating discussion. What a fascinating discussion. I'm sure you'll share the view with me that Professor Liao Yi does not only have the vision, the courage, a sharp tongue, and now we also know that he has a lot of time to help us engage and spread the word, and hopefully we can have more scientists like you to boost the future of science in China. Please join me, give a very good round of applause to thank you for sharing with us today.